Okay, welcome everyone to our introduction to recording earthworms in Wiltshire. So me and Keiron are going to kind of do half and half presentation that will last about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you think of any questions throughout, you can pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end, or we will invite you to unmute and ask your questions in person if you'd like to later on. So I'm going to cover a little bit of what is an earthworm and their taxonomy. We'll then look at the different ecological categories of earthworms, and then some of the ecosystem services that they provide and why they're important. And then I'll hand over to Keiron, who will cover sampling and identification, and then talk a bit about the National Earthworm Recording Scheme and particularly recording in Wiltshire. So I'm going to invite Keiron now just to unmute and do a very quick introduction to himself.
Yes, so I'm Keiron Brown. I'm the recording officer for the Earthworm Society of Britain, and I help set up and I run the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. So it's all about gathering earthworm species records from volunteer biological recorders and research institutions.
And I'm Kerry Calloway. I first got involved in earthworm recording about 12 years ago, and since then I've been running earthworm courses with the Earthworm Society of Britain and also with the FSC and their Violence project. So between us we have a little bit of experience in earthworms. So first of all, we should cover actually what is an earthworm. The name earthworm isn't a kind of scientific word. There's not a kind of real scientific definition of them. So if we just look in the dictionary, Earth can be the planet on which we live, or the substance of land or soil. And worm can be used to describe any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animals, or a weak or despicable person. So just to confirm, tonight we are talking about the creeping or burrowing invertebrates that live in the soil, not the despicable people that live on the planet. So we've got a little quiz for you. You've got 8 pictures here. They are all of worms, and we would like you to select which ones are earthworms. So Keiron has just popped a poll up on the screen. The pictures are numbered. And if you just click on the ones, on the numbers that you think are earthworms.
Yeah, you might need to, I was just going to say, you might need to do a little bit of moving around with the poll, so you can move the window that the poll's in to help you. You won't, yeah, and the poll is anonymous, so we can't see who said what. We can only see the total number of votes for each one. Kerry, back to you.
Yeah. Okay, we've got some answers coming in. I'll give you a little bit longer to do it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you get any wrong. We're going to go through the answers. You're here to learn. Yep. But we just wanted to make sure that nobody's fallen asleep after having an early dinner or anything like that. So, and it's always good to see what people get confused with. All right, I think we'll just give it a couple more seconds. And I'm going to end it now and hand back to Kerry. So here's the results, Kerry.
Okay, so we can see the results there. So I think 100% of you said that the pictures 3, 5, and 7 were all earthworms. So well done, they are. That's excellent. 8 also, picture 8's got quite a lot of votes for earthworms, so half of you said it was. Picture 8 is actually an enchytraeid. It's also called a potworm. It's not an earthworm, but it is a very small oligochaete that does live in the soil, but they're only a few millimeters long and always very pale. And then a few said number 1 was an earthworm. It does look like an earthworm. You can see those segments, but it's not. It's actually a leech, that one. Number 2, the terrifying looking thing is called a bobbit worm, and this is a type of polychaete, so it's vaguely related to earthworms, but it's not an earthworm, and it actually lives in the sediment at the bottom of the sea, and then it's kind of an ambush predator, so will jump out and catch prey. And number 6, you all got that one right. No one said it was an earthworm, and you're right, it is actually a slow worm, that one, so it's a type of lizard. So just to confirm, you can see the ones that are earthworms, 3, 4, 5, and 7. Well done. So moving on to the taxonomy. The taxonomy of earthworms, or of annelids more widely, is a mess. And Keiron spent a lot of lockdown with earthworm scientists from around the world trying to agree amongst themselves actually where earthworms fit in the kind of annelid group. So they are in the phylum Annelida, and that's all segmented worms. And that can then be split into 2 groups. So you've got the polychaetes, so that bobbit worm, the terrifying looking one that lives at the bottom of the sea, is an annelid but not an earthworm. And then you've also got the Clitellata, and these are a group of worms that all have a clitellum, and Keiron will talk about what a clitellum is a bit later on. And then the Clitellata are split into leeches and oligochaetes. And then this is where it starts to get really kind of complicated, and every year it changes. But the oligochaetes can be split into several orders. And at the moment, we're agreed that one of those orders, called the Crussiclitellata, is the true earthworms. And within that order, there's just over 5,000 species that have been described so far. I suspect that there are a lot more out there that haven't been discovered yet. And there's just over 20 families, 3 of which are found in the British Isles. There are, or I'm not going to say there's there are a number of species in the British Isles, but almost all of them fit in or fall into one family, which is the Lumbricidae. So moving on to the different ecological categories of earthworms that we have. They can be split into 3 or 4 ecological groups, and this is quite useful for telling us kind of what substrate the earthworm is living in and what niche it's fulfilling in the ecosystem. So we've got 3 or 4 groups, depending on who you talk to, and it's important to say that they're not taxonomic groups, these ones. They are just kind of functional groups. So you can have 2 species, for example, that are not closely related, but are in the same ecological category. They're kind of living in the same substrate, doing similar things in the environment. And then you can also have species that are closely related taxonomically, but are actually fulfilling quite different roles in the environment and living in slightly different microhabitats. And I'll go through each of these ecological groups in a bit more detail. So this slide just kind of gives an overview of those groups and whereabouts in the soil profile you are most likely to find them. So we've got the Transects, which make these kind of deep, permanent vertical burrows. We've got Endogeics, which make horizontal burrows in the upper layers of the soil. And then we've got epigeics on the surface, so you can find them in leaf litter, in amongst grass roots, all sorts of different microhabitats on the soil surface. And then the 4th group are the composters, and as the name suggests, you find them in compost. So the anesic earthworms, so these are the deep vertical burrow making ones. They make these permanent vertical burrows that they live in, and they feed on soil in the burrows, and then they also come up to the surface, usually at night time, and collect plant material from the surface, so dead leaves and things, for example, and they'll drag that back down inside the burrow, and then they'll feed on it in the burrow. And these worms are the largest ones that we have in Britain, and they tend to be quite dark, particularly at the head end. So there's one species that's actually, its common name is the black-headed worm, but always quite dark, particularly at the head. The second group are the Endogeics. So these ones are living in the upper layers of the soil, and they're making those horizontal burrows. And these guys are just feeding on soil. So they rarely come to the surface. You rarely see them unless you're actually digging in soil. They're always pale in colour, but you can get different colours. So you get kind of pinky ones, there's a green one, there's some that are quite sort of greyish blue in colour, but always pale. Keiron always describes them as looking a little bit sickly, but they're meant to look like that. That is their natural colour. And then the third kind of true group are the epigeics. So these are the ones that are living on the surface. And you get them in all sorts of different microhabitats, but they like kind of high nutrient rich substrates. And generally the substrate that you find them in is the thing that they're eating. So you can find them in dung and they're feeding on the dung. You can find them in dead wood, they're feeding on the dead wood. You find them lots in leaf litter and they're feeding on the litter there. And there are lots of different species of these, and it looks at the moment like some of the species particularly probably are quite specialist to certain microhabitats. They tend to be quite small in size and usually quite dark in colour, so quite sort of dark purpley red, and one's always quite small. And then the final group are the composters. So these really are kind of a subgroup of the epigeics, so the surface dwellers as well, and they live in compost. Occasionally you can get them sort of outside of compost bins, but it is very rare. Generally they are just found in compost bins or in like piles of grass clippings. And so they're feeding on really, really nutrient rich substrates. And they are sort of medium in size and then usually have kind of dark and pale stripes. So moving on to the ecosystem services that earthworms provide and why they're important. They are essential for our soils, and the world and soils wouldn't exist as we know it without earthworms. So they do lots of different really good things, really important things for our soil. One of them is they act as nature's recycler. So they're decomposers and they're feeding on dead organic material. And they're feeding on it, further breaking it down, recycling it into more fertile substrates. So if we didn't have earthworms and other decomposers, then everything that's ever lived on the planet and all of the waste it's produced would still be here. So the world would be a big mess. So earthworms, and there are lots of other decomposers, are really, really important for breaking all of this stuff down and recycling it. So the earthworms feed on whatever they're feeding, so dead leaves, dung, the things we're putting in our compost, dead wood, and they're digesting that inside them. They are obviously taking nutrients for themselves to grow and to move and to reproduce and live their lives, but they are also then pooing the rest out and producing these earthworm casts. And earthworm casts are basically like really nice fertile soil. So they're recycling those nutrients into really good quality fertile soil that plants and all sorts of other organisms in the soil can use. They also help to drain and aerate the soil. So this is through their burrows. And if you've got lots of earthworm burrows in soil, then when it rains, the rain can just drain away nicely through the burrows. If you've got really compacted soil with no burrows in it, then you are much more likely to have a flood. So earthworms are really good for kind of reducing flood risk. And those burrows also help to aerate the soil. So it's helping the soil to breathe. It's allowing oxygen to get in the soil. It's allowing waste products of respiration from other organisms out of the soil, and just allowing everything living in the soil to have a bit of space and a bit of air and stay nice and healthy. And also through making their burrows in the soil and kind of decompacting the soil, loosening it, it's making it much easier for plants to grow. So if you're a plant trying to spread your roots through the soil, if you're in quite loose soil, it's much easier for you to grow your roots, get to nutrients, get to water. Whereas if you're a plant living in really compacted soil, where there's no earthworm burrows, then you're going to have to use a lot of energy just to grow your roots a little bit. So earthworm burrows and earthworms are vital again, just for helping plants and helping general soil health. They also act as nature's plough, and this is through a process called bioturbation. And this just means disturbing the soil, or a living organism that's disturbing the soil. So this is demonstrated really nicely by these kind of worm kits that you can buy, and they're marketed for children, but they're great fun to kind of have at home and watch the earthworms doing their thing. So you kind of layer up your Perspex box with layers of soil and layers of sand, and then you pop your earthworms in, make sure they've got food and water in there, and cover it so that it's dark for them, because that's what they like. But every now and again, you can then go and check on the progress of the earthworms. And over a couple of weeks, you'll see that the layers of the sand and the soil all get mixed up and disappear. And that's just through the earthworms moving around and kind of ploughing that soil, mixing it all up. And that's really important out in the wild for mixing all of the nutrients, all of the things in the soil, just kind of mixing it up, stopping soil becoming really compacted and having like separate layers. It's good to have it all mixed up. And then they also act as nature's burial service. So if you imagine a paving slab on the grass in your garden, if you leave it there for many years, eventually it will become buried under the soil. And that is because of earthworms. So the earthworms are living in the soil under the paving slab. They're feeding on the soil, they're moving around. They come up to the sides to do their poos around the edge. And so you can see in the picture on the bottom of the screen, gradually the soil will start to kind of rise up at the sides around the paving slab or the rock. And eventually they'll keep doing that. They'll keep kind of excavating their burrows underneath, and then the weight of the stone will cause the burrows to collapse. And gradually the stone will sink down into the soil and become buried, and then the worms will start casting or pooing on the top as well. So the stone can become completely buried. And then the final ecosystem service that they provide is a really obvious one, but it's kind of looking at it from a different point of view, is food. So all sorts of things eat earthworms. We've got lots of cute pictures of vertebrates here eating them. Birds of prey also eat lots of earthworms. Badgers, up to 50% of an average badger's diet is earthworms. And in some badger populations, 80% of their diet can be earthworms, so really, really important. Moles apparently eat 60 earthworms a day, so really important for them. And there's also lots of invertebrates as well that eat earthworms, so centipedes, flatworms, leeches, some beetles, they all eat earthworms. And there's also lots of parasites that will get them. So they're really, really important kind of link in the food chain for lots of different animals. So back to our slide that shows the different ecological groups and where they are in the soil profile. And then this just links the ecosystem services that they provide. Because obviously, if you've got different species or different groups living in slightly different places, living in different substrates, feeding on different things, then they're going to provide different ecosystem services. So the anesics and the endogeics with their burrows in the soil, they're really important for recycling because they're still feeding on plant material and soil, breaking it down further, recycling those nutrients. The burrows, as I mentioned, are really important for draining and aerating the soil. They're churning up, ploughing the soil, and they're involved in the burial. And obviously they are also food for animals as well. And then the epigeics on the composters, which are living more on the surface, are really important again for recycling and also as food for other species. And so all of that has led to earthworms being classified as ecosystem engineers. So this is an organism that directly or indirectly modulates the availability of resources to other species and physically modifies, maintains, and or creates habitats. So kind of famous or well-known example of an ecosystem engineer is beaver, who's chopping down trees, making dams, completely transforming the environment that it's living in. But earthworms are also engineering the ecosystem. And so they're modulating the availability of resources to other species through all their recycling. through the breaking down dead plant material and the fertile poos. And they're also modifying, maintaining and or creating habitats through the ploughing and the burial service. And I'm going to hand over to Keiron now, who's going to cover sampling, identification and recording. Thank you.
Helps if I'm unmuted, doesn't it? So I'm going to go through what it means to actually go out and survey, ID and record earthworms. This is not going to be a full training course on that. It does take a bit more than that. So it's just going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So for sampling earthworms, we need to remember those different ecological categories that Kerry's been talking about, because there are different sampling methods well, different sampling methods are more effective for different types of earthworm. So it may not surprise you that the first type of surveying that we do is actually digging for earthworms. We know we find earthworms in the soil. So we call this soil pit sampling. We excavate a block of soil, we hand sort through it, as Kerry is nicely demonstrating here, and we take out any earthworms that we find. I will point this out a bit later, but earthworms can't be identified in the field. We can identify them using a microscope in Great Britain. The rest of the world, most countries around the world, you would actually need to dissect them to be able to tell the species apart. So this kind of surveying is really good for the endogeic species, so those shallow burrowing earthworms that live in the soil. The anesic earthworms, it's not so good. So even though you will find them through this method, they're quite good at escaping when you start digging, because they've got those vertical burrows and they'll just go further down, whereas the endogeics are not able to get away as much. So to find the anesics, what you can do is use what we call a vermifuge sampling technique. So vermifuge comes from the Latin vermi meaning worm and fuge means separate. So it's to separate the earthworms from the soil. Traditionally, they would have used formalin, potassium permanganate. These are both quite environmentally unfriendly. And formalin's not very friendly to people either. So it's been found that a mustard solution works the same. So it acts as an irritant to the earthworm. You pour it on the ground. As it soaks into the ground, it irritates the earthworms and they come up. Washing up liquid has also been suggested, but like formalin and potassium permanganate, it's possibly not very good environmentally, and I don't think I think it's worse for the earthworms as well. It seems to kind of affect the mucus on the that they have around on their skin. So that gets us the anesics and the endogeics, but if we want the compost and the epigeics, then which are the epigeics are the surface dwelling earthworms. Oh, I'll come on to that in a sec. What we will do with these sampling methods is, if we want to standardize how we sample a site, we'll do that in transects of 5 pits we do for the recording scheme. If you're doing a much more detailed study though, you might need to do a lot more. And this is because the soil can be very variable and very patchy. So I was out digging the other day for a survey of a nature reserve in Kingston in South London. And one soil pit's very dry, a metre away, it was quite wet, so it can be really variable. So those microhabitats I was talking about, there's any kind of microhabitat where you might find an earthworm, you might find something a bit different. So things like tree roots, compost to get those composting species. Dung is also very good for those composting species. Really wet soils, you get some wet soil specialists under plant pots, in deadwood, in leaf litter. All of these microhabitats need to be searched if you want to get as many species as you can when surveying a site, so to get a full picture. And actually, in a lot of research, microhabitats are not looked at, which means that we have a picture of just a few ecological categories that Kerry described. So once we've got the earthworms, how do we identify them? Well, first of all, I wanted to launch a quick poll. I've got to find where that is now. I want you to tell me how many species you think there are in Britain. So this is how many species in Great Britain. It is anonymous, like the last poll. One answer only this time. And I'll give you a clue. The number has twos or nines in it. That's discounted one. Yeah, nobody's gone for 2 yet. That's good because we told you there are at least 4 different ecological categories of earthworms. So yeah, I'll give you a couple more seconds. Come on, we've still got a few here to vote. All right, there we go. I think we've got just about everybody there. Right, okay, so over half of you have went for 29. That's right. We have 29 species in Great Britain, 31 in the British Isles. That's as of now. I'm sure it will go up as species are split or we find more. A few of you went a lot more. In other countries around the world, so in France, they've got over 100 and they're our neighbour. So we're actually quite undiverse when it comes to earthworm fauna. We don't have a lot, and that's to do with the last ice age and not a lot of species colonizing since then. Right, okay, so how do we identify our earthworms? There is a great identification key which is produced by the organisation that I work for in my day job, which is the Field Studies Council. And that's the key to the earthworms of the UK and Ireland, and it's part of the Aid Gap series. So that stands for Aids to the Identification of Difficult Groups of Animals and Plants. And these guides are designed for amateur naturalists. They're not designed for taxonomists. Any technical language that they use, they explain, and they use relatively simple questions. With earthworms, it's a lot of counting. And what it will do is it doesn't necessarily, they don't come out necessarily in the taxonomic order. It chooses the easiest question first, for example, in the key, rather than ordering them in a way that makes it difficult to identify them. First thing you need to know about Earthworm ID is this feature here, the Clitellum that Kerry mentioned, which is present in all annelids belonging to Clitellata. And this fleshy band is a feature that's used during earthworm mating. It's important for that. It's a glandular swelling. And the presence of it tells us it tells us 2 things. First of all, it tells us which end is the head. So the Clitellum is always closest to the head end. So in this one here, we can see that the head end is here, tail end is there. It also tells us that this earthworm is an adult. So adult earthworms have the Clitellum. When they're juveniles, the Clitellum hasn't fully formed yet. And we can only identify adult earthworms, so we can't identify them without the saddle. So any earthworms that we find when we're surveying that do not have a saddle, we return to the soil or the substrate that we found them in, because there's no point taking them because we can't identify them. But we may count them so that we've got a figure for abundance. So, and morphology of an earthworm is pretty simple. There isn't a lot that you can see with a dissecting or low power microscope. Starting at the head end, they have a head. Moving down, there's a feature called the millpaw, and I'll go through all these very briefly. Then you've got the saddle, which has a feature on it called the tubercular pubitatis, which we refer to as the TP. And then along the whole of the earthworm, you've got these little dots. These refer to setae. So these are pairs of little tiny bristles that the earthworm uses for locomotion. And in the Lumbricidae species, you'll have 4 pairs of these. So they'll have 8 around each segment, and they'll be present on every segment along the earthworm. So moving down that earthworm and looking at the ID features, you've got the head, and that can be one of 2 types. So it can be epilobic or tanolobic. And what we're looking at here are these grooves here, and that tells us if it goes all the way down, like it does there, it's tanolobic. If it goes part way down, it's epilobic. And when we teach ID courses, this is something that we teach down the microscope. The male paw, we're really just looking at what segment that's on. It's usually on most British species on segment 15. Occasionally it's somewhere else depending on the species. And that's this slit. It can be quite variable. On some it almost looks like it's swollen like this, which we call raised. Sometimes it just looks like a slit. And on this one here, I think it's here, but you can hardly see it. Down a microscope, that would be very difficult to see. Next feature along is the Clitellum, and what we'll be looking at here is what segment it starts on. So here we can see it starts on the segment and what segment it finishes on. And on that one, it's this one here. I know it looks like it's just on half of it, but we would still count that. And yeah, we're counting the segment number it starts on, the segment number it ends on. It's variable between species, but there's also usually a range even within a species. So it's quite rare that it's really set in stone, that it starts on a definite segment. Usually there's a bit of a range. On the saddle, we're looking at that feature, the TP that I mentioned. And again, we're looking where that starts and where it ends. We're also looking at the shape of it. And really, once you know your earthworms, it's all about the TP. That's how you get the species. So here we can see it's this blister-like feature that we can see here. This what's referred to in the key as a thick band. On here, it's these two bumps, which I say looks more like a pair of aviators. So yeah, it's variable between species. But again, the start and end, it can be a little bit of a range sometimes, so it's not always completely set in stone. So there can be a little bit of overlap between different species. And then the final thing we look at, which I think is the hardest, is the C-tier spacing. So in the key, it's categorized as two different types. In reality, it's a bit more complicated than that, because the taxonomists will actually measure the distance, and they'll measure the distance within a pair and between the pairs, and they have this really complicated formula, which I don't even really understand, that tells you how to categorize it. So in reality, there are more than two types, but for the purpose of identifying British earthworms, they're being categorized as what we call closely paired, where the two C-tier in a pair are quite close together, and widely paired, as we can see here, where they're quite far apart. We can see there's another pairing there, and that can be quite tricky. Sometimes it's quite tricky to even see these hairs on the earthworm, and that's probably the thing that when me and Kerry are teaching people, that we need to give them more support with. When you're counting, you always start at the head, and then you count along and you mark, you note down what number different features there are and what shape there are. So this is an example of a species which we call Apparetidae caliginosa, really common. And here I've marked on the features so that you can see what we'd be looking at when we're looking at the earthworm. With the C-tier spacing, we always look towards the tail end, because the C-tier spacing can actually even vary along the length of the earthworm. So the feature has been standardized looking at the tail end. So that's a whistle-stop tour of ID. And I just want to end for the last 7 minutes talking a little bit about recording earthworms and why that's important and what it has taught us about earthworms over the last 10 years of the recording scheme. So if we go back to 2009, this is a map of the peacock butterfly, courtesy of Butterfly Conservation, and it's got two time periods mapped. It's got 1995 to 1999 and 2005 to 2009. And what we can see here is, I think in this map in 2005 to 2009, that appears under 95 to 99 if they're present there as well. So we can see that there's new areas where the peacock has been found. So we've got enough information here to not just talk about the distribution, but how that distribution is changing over time. If we look at earthworm records in 2009, first of all, there's a lot less money in mapping earthworms than there is in butterflies, so we've got a less fancy map. But a paper that was produced by a number of earthworm scientists who collated all their data together. This is a map of all earthworm species in 2009 across the UK and Ireland. And you can see that the distribution there is really patchy. It looks like big parts of Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland don't have earthworms at all. And we know that's not true. We know there are earthworms there, but this is more representative of how little data we have and how patchy it is. So the Earthworm Recording Scheme was set up in response to this paper, and we launched it formally in 2014. And what we do is we gather earthworm data sets from research organizations and things like government agencies that collate data on earthworms. We also train up and collect data from earthworm recorders, so amateur naturalists. So we go out surveying sites like we're going to in Wiltshire. We do ID courses, with microscopes so that people can learn how to identify earthworms and do their own surveying in their own gardens, etc. That data goes into the recording scheme, and we're big believers in open data. So we share all of our data with the Association of Local Environmental Record Centres so that it's available locally for use by the Wildlife Trust and things like that when they're looking at what species they've got on their sites. We also share it nationally, and it's publicly all available through the NBN Atlas. In Ireland, less relevant to Wiltshire, we do the same, but it's through a slightly different platform. And then those data sets are both then shared globally through a portal called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So they're shared there alongside records from around the world, where they're used in research projects, etc. So we make sure that it's all used, and we actually won an award a few years ago for how open our data is as well, which is really great to get that recognition. So earthworms in Wiltshire. I looked at our data and looked at what we've got. So these are the 29 species that we've got in Great Britain. We can see that there are a lot of gaps here, and we can see that Vice County 7, which is North Wiltshire, we've got a lot more species. We've got 16 species. In Vice County 8, which is South Wiltshire, we've only got 6 species. Yeah, we've only got 224 species records full stop. So that is a species at a point in time at a site. 158 of them are from North Wiltshire and only 66 from South Wiltshire. So what this tells me is not that the earthworm diversity of Wiltshire is bad, but that we have very little data. And if we look at some maps of some of those records, so Lumbricus terrestris, otherwise known as the common earthworm, although it's not the most common earthworm, to be honest, we can see when we look at these maps of North and South Wiltshire separated out, North Wiltshire on top made sense and South Wiltshire on the bottom, we can see that there's a lot of parts of Wiltshire where we still have no records. Icenia fetida is the brandling worm that you find in compost bins, and again we can see there's very few dots on that map. Those are two of our really common earthworms. Octalasian cyanium is another fairly common earthworm, but it tends to not be picked up sometimes as much in earthworm surveys, and because it's not maybe as abundant as some of the more common ones, even though you do find it quite widespread. That hasn't been picked up in South Wiltshire at all. And Lumbricus festivus is an earthworm that is classed as rare. I don't really think it's truly rare, if I'm honest. I think we just don't have enough data on it yet. And that's never been found in either of the Vice counties. So there are still a lot of gaps in our data here. And you can see even in those maps of North Wiltshire that some of the dots are the same for the first 3 species, and that's because they've been picked up in the same set of surveying. You may notice that one of those sites is Lower Moor Farm Reserve, which is one of the reserves that we're going to go and survey with Wiltshire Wildlife Trust again, and build up more data for that site. But we'll also be going to South Coombs Bissett Down in South Wiltshire, so we'll have some new dots for the map there as well. So if we look nationally, we've been gathering data since 2014. It may look like we haven't got that much in 2022. Some of those peaks in the data where we've actually had big research data sets in as well. 1,794 records for a year for us really isn't bad. We can see that most of the records are in England. So although Wiltshire isn't really very well recorded, Wales, there's huge gaps there. Northern Ireland, we need a lot more. And almost all of that data in Scotland is from a couple of research projects looking at agriculture rather than actual earthworm recording. So there's still loads of work for us to do. In total now, though, we've got 21,760 earthworm species occurrence records, or at least we did when I did this. I've accepted more records on iRecord since then, and they just haven't been added to the database yet. They haven't been downloaded yet. So it's growing all the time. And to give you context, some of the big earthworm research projects like that 2009 paper and a Natural England report, we're dealing with between 3,000 and 7,000 records. So we've got more data than we've ever had, and we've made huge leaps and bounds in the data we've got. What does our map look like now of the British Isles? Much, much better. Now, a lot of those dots are from one particular data set, which is the Environment Agency, and they're all the same species. So there's still a lot more gaps to fill. And this gives you an idea looking at the dots of our research records versus our recorder records. So a lot of that data is still from research. And there are some problems with that. So this image here shows you that Natural England report I mentioned. The data on the right is the research records that made up that Natural England report. And it's organized by it's the number of earthworms, the percentage of total number of earthworms ordered by abundance. So the one at the top, you've got the most. And Ecological chlorotica there makes up over a third of all earthworms, according to that report that was released back in 2014. When I look at our recorder data, which is much more variable in terms of habitat and sampling method, we can see that the data that we had from the research data maybe doesn't tell us a full picture, because when we've got people going out and looking under logs, looking in compost bins, we're starting to get different data. And if we reorganize that chart according to the recorder data, we get a different picture. We get a less steep curve. We'd find more of the really rare stuff, and some of the species would move around quite a bit. Like Merciona muldali there, we can see in the recorder data is much more rare. And that's not surprising, because it's something that you do get quite a lot in agricultural systems and you find less commonly in other systems. So when we look at that data in a bit more detail, this is just some very preliminary statistical analysis that myself and Frank Ashwood from Forest Research, you can see grinning in the bottom left corner there, have done on our research and recording scheme data. And basically, this shows you sampling methods, so microhabitat against habitat. And we've separated out the recordings data on the left and the research data on the right. And the darker the color, the more data there is for that combination. And what we can see with the research data on the right is it's really polar. Squares tend to be really dark or completely white, so completely absent of data. And we can see that the majority of data there really seems to be sole pits on farmland. And that's what we find a lot of researchers do when they're out doing research, because there's a lot of money in checking agricultural sites, and sole pit surveying is a really good way of standardizing your surveying. But the data on the left-hand side shows that our recorders are looking in a wider range of habitats, and they're using a wider range of surveying methods. The one anomaly there is the sole pit plus vermifuge, and that's because our recorders, when they do vermifuge, they tend to separate out the data. So they'll give us the vermifuge data separately from the sole pit data, so we're not really missing out on too much there. But this is part of a scientific paper that we'll be publishing next year. So more to come with this. And I'll mention a talk I'm going to do on this that's also free, that you can book on shortly. So how can you get involved? First thing you need to do is get trained up. And we do a range of training courses and events. So we're going to be doing some earthworm sampling days in Wiltshire, but to learn how to ID, you really need to come on one of our Earthworm ID with microscopes or our Identifying and Recording Earthworms courses, which is a residential course. We've got some running in the southeast and in the West Midlands up in Shropshire. I'm not sure if or how many spaces we've got left, but you can check out the Field Studies Council's website for that. Some free opportunities we've got. I'm going to be doing a NTOR live webinar on recording. So that's talking about 10 years of the National Earthworm Recording Scheme, when I'm going to go into a lot more detail about how we're using the data and some of the ecological and distribution information that we're getting from that. So I'm going to completely rip apart what Kerry said about ecological categories when we've got a paper published that we're working on at the moment, because actually we think it's a lot more complicated and a lot less simple than those categories. And that's part of the Enter Live webinar series, which is a series of free webinars that focuses on invertebrate science. So there's lots of other topics like mayflies and climate change and all sorts, and I'll drop that link in the chat when I finish speaking. Something else that I wanted to mention is the Field Studies Council's online Discovering Earthworms course. So that will go into a lot more detail about the biology and ecology of earthworms. We don't teach ID on it because you do need a microscope for ID, but we go a lot more into the ecology and biology and earthworm diversity even around the world as well. And that's just 20 quid. And the next run of it starts in a couple of weeks, and it'll be the last time it's 20 quid because it's covered by the subsidised BioLinks project. And then the last two things I wanted to mention, we have a free to sign up to National Earthworm Recording Scheme bulletin, which all Earthworm Society members are welcome to sign up to, but you don't have to be. Non-members are welcome too. And you just go onto our Earthworm Society written website on the recording page and pop your email in there and click subscribe, and then you can sign up to that. And we tell you about all of our events and courses, updates from the recording scheme there. And the last thing I wanted to end on was just a reminder about what I mentioned at the beginning. We'll be doing 2 sampling days in Wiltshire, one at Lower Moor Farm Nature Reserve in North Wiltshire, and one at Coombe Down Nature Reserve in South Wiltshire. They're free to take part. We need as many volunteers as possible. It does involve taking earthworm specimens, so we will be collecting the earthworms, popping them into tubes of ethanol and taking them away for ID. But as hopefully you've seen today, without more information about earthworms, we can't say which ones are rare, which ones might need protecting, etc. So I'm gonna stop the recording now as well.